things. And I think films like this really do make a difference in the world. So, Max, do you want to say any more about the film? And because you've seen pieces of this footage before, right?
Yes. First, let me say that this is the second time that I relived 3 years of misery. And my first point would be that what you saw was the external life out of the apartments, and it's undescribable, or you probably couldn't watch what was happening in the apartments. The other thing, it makes me feel extremely bad and sad that today in the United Nations they allowed a speaker that says that this never happened. And ironically, I think that living in the 21st century, I think a person like that should not be allowed to speak to the public at large. Secondly, a lot of these things that you saw in this film were staged, but they showed the reality on the background. For instance, we had horse meat to eat because the 2 horses that you saw in the funeral were horses in a company that was called Pink-Eared Undertaker. But when the starvation, as you saw Enna was there, they were slaughtered, and you know that we always eat kosher. So there was an exception made by the rabbis where you can take certain veins out of the hindquarter and also use it as kosher meat. I was thinking about the faces in the people that were in the film. You could read in them that they were average people just like you are here, and good people that didn't believe that these things were happening to him because they actually were not capable of committing crimes like that. Now you might say, look at the people that moving the bodies. You know, if somebody becomes a doctor and he goes to school and he sees blood and he faints, but then the same person, after being there daily and looking at blood daily, becomes a surgeon, and blood is nothing to him. And this is what happens when these people had to do it. Or you walk on the street and you see a body, and when you get used to it, it's just like nothing else. You might say that some of us that survived, we survived by luck and by having trades that we could work for him. And if you worked for him, you lived. But we also had to have wisdom and try to outsmart them. And any law that they made, we had another answer to answer that. We are not heroes because luck played a great part in it, and especially on me. But looking in there, and I don't know if you notice what kind of people these were. Did you see a boy fall and another little boy came back, endangering his life? Because if the Germans saw it, and he picked the other boy up, even in this sorrow. There was a woman standing and she was begging. And did you see a man go by and take a few, maybe pennies, and give it to him. And you always say, how can beggars give beggars? Well, these people lived in apartments. Each room had about 7 people, which means 21 people. There were no families big enough like the 21 that lived in there. So even though they didn't have anything, but they shared in dignity without fighting or killing each other. And on every face, you can see, even on the stage ones, you can see that they were doing it in order to either save their life, and you know, in our religion, if you save only one life, it's the same if you're saving the whole world. That's about what I can say right off the hand, and in many instances, what you don't also understand is when the ghetto, when they were taking out a lot of people out of the ghetto, the original section of the ghetto had all the belongings. The people that were faced into the ghetto only could bring in what they could carry on their person. But when the population was dwindling, they didn't allow you to stay in the area where you had everything. They would move you where they have all the people concentrated in one spot. And I might also say that what you saw in there, there were Jewish people that were authorized by the leaders of the ghetto, Mr., you know, the one that was in charge. Then they had eldest rabbis that were like a city council. They extorted money for them to build the wall, plus what they confiscated from the Jewish population. But also, they were authorized to enlist 2,000 capos. And you saw them with the sticks beating on their own families for fear of their own life and being blackmailed into for fear that they would kill their families if they didn't do it, or giving them a little bit more food to do this. And sometimes they were worse than anybody. Didn't say anything about the fighting in there, because that was a great blow to them, because that created atmosphere after the fighting where it gave courage to other places to do the same thing. And in fact, Treblinka was destroyed. By the time we were taken, after the burning of the ghetto, we were taken to Majdanek. The capos got their reward after the uprising, and their reward was the same as the mass grave that you saw. They were all machine gunned and buried the same way as the corpses that you saw. I went 5 times on the March of the Living, and this year, right after Passover, I believe it was either April or May, I was in the Warsaw Ghetto. It's the largest, I mean, I was in the Warsaw Ghetto area, but I was in the Warsaw Cemetery. And at the gate of the cemetery, where the bodies were, you know, like they were stacked in the buildings, they were eventually buried. So when you enter the cemetery, there are concrete posts that are maybe like 24 inches wide and maybe 10 inches thick with a black mark on them. But they're done, I think there are either 12 or 13 around the place where all these bodies were buried. And there's a little cavity because there are no tombstones. All you see is the concrete posts, which are kind of wide with a black stripe on describing the place where most of the people died in the ghetto. I think I've said enough, and now I would like some of your opinion or any questions that might have.
I know some of you have some questions. Some of you students must have a question. Yes?